Well, combined with like 3 months from the first thing that didn't take.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming on such a beautiful day. Thank you for showing up, and this is a great crowd. Great Friday morning here in Seagirt. So welcome to the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey. I'm Sergeant Walker. I'm the curator here, and we're always on the look for great local history presentations, and I'm excited as someone who lives in Tom's River to hear about our basically our patron saint there. So I'm glad to hear Mr. Gardell present about basically the Monmouth County Militia and Joshua Huddy. So so without further ado, William Gardell.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. And today I was just going to be talking about, in particularly, Captain Joshua Huddy, who is famous from the American Revolution. In his exploits were from what is now Monmouth and Ocean County, which at the time was actually just all Monmouth County. The ocean had not been separated from Monmouth County yet. But Joshua, or Jack Huddy, as he was better known, was born in 1735 to a fairly wealthy Quaker family in Salem County, New Jersey. His grandfather was actually a judge, Judge Hugh Huddy, as well as a merchant. And his family had immigrated from England in the 1600s, so they're fairly early settlers. There was many different religious and ethnic groups that settled in what is now New Jersey. The earliest settlers in what is now New Jersey had actually been Swedish and like along the Delaware River, but in very small numbers in the early 1600s. Swedes and Finns, Finland was part of Sweden at the time, so that's why. And then basically less than a generation later, the Dutch took over New Jersey, New Netherlands, New York, New Jersey was their colony. But then basically not even a generation later, the English took over the entire area. So we were an English colony by the 1660s, which is when many of the English-speaking settlers settled here. And many of them actually came from, not directly from England, but actually from New England, who had English immigrants who had already been in the New World. This land is now opened up in New York and New Jersey, so they moved from Rhode Island and Massachusetts into our area. So many of them were actually already Americans, English-speaking colonists. But some, of course, also came directly from Britain or elsewhere, because Britain was fairly loose about who could settle. It was if you could come here, if you could hack it, you were generally allowed to come here, basically. So the Quakers were a particular religious group. Almost everyone in New Jersey was Protestant by that point. England was a strictly Protestant nation, your denomination was a big deal. It's almost unimaginable compared to today how much of a difference that was, even among English Protestant groups. Now it's like you can barely tell the difference at all, even for people who are interested in that type of thing. Back then, it was a big deal. So the Quakers were famous for being extremely pious, even in a time when everyone was relatively pious by today's standards. They were famous for being pacifists, as in they would, not get involved in fighting or wars of any kind for the most part. They're just, very strict, even in a time when everyone was strict in terms of religion. So Huddy was not a natural Quaker in the sense that he was actually a bit of a troublemaker by basically all accounts throughout really his whole life, including his, young adulthood. And he was eventually kicked out of the Society of Friends, which is what the Quakers were known as, at the age of 22. So being excommunicated from your church was also a big deal back then. It wasn't like, it's almost not comparable to anything today because religion is so casual now in the 21st century. But he was kicked out of his church and basically for drinking and womanizing and fighting and all the type of things you would expect people to be ostracized from the strict religious community for. But he was also eventually forced to sell his 300-acre farm in Salem County, as he had fallen into debt and was forced to sell off his farm, which was also a major issue. Your owning land was everything back then. It was your livelihood, and it was also your status. It made you owning land allowed. Not everyone could vote. At that time, you had to be a landowner to vote. Things like that. Even after the Revolution, actually. But this is before the Revolution. So that was also a major issue, and he also had to spend time in debtor's prison, which was not uncommon. Is basically back, and this comes from England. It was from the if you had to owe money to someone, you could actually be sent to jail, basically just for owing money to someone, even totally private person-to-person debts. Generally it favored wealthier people because those are the people who people owed money to. Perhaps they had lent them money or had, rented lands out to someone, and those people would most likely not face that. But poor people who may have to borrow money at some time or lent money, it was fairly common to be sent to jail, and you would spend a period of time in jail basically just to discourage people from falling into private debts. Not sure how you were actually supposed to make your money while you're in jail to pay them back, but it was basically a way of saying, don't fall into debt. But Huddy had fallen into debt and been in debtor's prison. This is before the Revolution. But during the American Revolution is when he really came into his own and really started becoming he reached near folk hero status even during his own lifetime in Monmouth and Ocean County and New Jersey as a whole, really, because of his exploits during the war and his leadership in the community. So back to his personal life. His personal life was somewhat complicated. He had married a widow named Mary Borden in 1764, and this is before the Revolution. And then he eventually had two daughters with her, Elizabeth and Martha. Eventually his daughters would actually file a petition to the very new federal government after the American Revolution, basically looking for some type of compensation for their father's service in the Revolution, which had of course affected their lives as well as young girls during this time, because this is before a formalized VA pension system and those type of benefits were set up. The federal government was extremely small and brand new at this time. Like this is late 1800s, early 1900s. And they had filed a petition basically to receive compensation for, stuff that they lost as a result of their father's service during the war, which was substantial. But they were, turned down by the Congress for their, petition. And then, so after Mary, his first wife, passed, he then moved from Salem County to Colts Neck, New Jersey, which is where he's most associated with living. That's where he was living before and during the Revolution. And he had married another widow, which was also, somewhat risque back then. Not so much, but the fact that he did it twice, I guess. He married a widow named Catherine Applegate Hart, she was the widow of a fairly prosperous merchant and tavern owner, Levi Hart, who owned what is now the Colts Neck Inn, or Colts Neck Tavern. And he was, Catherine was Protestant, Levi was Jewish, which was fairly uncommon for back then, but not unheard of in New Jersey. There was actually a small small Jewish settlement even that early in the area, but still pretty rare for the overall American colonies. And so she was a widow, and he basically, as her husband, now kind of inherited the business, mostly took it over, and of the Colts Neck, and which still stands to this day in Colts Neck. And she was, and this was probably the most controversial part of Huddy. Of course, there's three sides to every story, you know, his side, her side, and the truth, as they say. But essentially, it was felt that he had more or less put her children, you know, from her first marriage, kind of out of the business, and kind of took it over for himself, more or less, as in kind of cutting them out of it, and, you know, more or less put her adult children, you know, out on the street, so to speak. And they actually the Applegate family would eventually sue Joshua Huddy over that. So that was one of his controversial personal life aspects. But, you know, Huddy is, of course, remembered not for his personal life, but for his exploits as a patriot during the American Revolution. But, of course, everyone is complicated. So, let's see. And this was in the Scobeyville section of what is now Colts Neck. Okay. And then, let's see. And when the revolution began in 1775 in New England, not much had really happened until 1776 in New Jersey, particularly. But the Monmouth County, like all counties, had its own militia. Men were generally expected to serve throughout the colonies in the militia from age 16 to 60. So there wasn't a draft per se, but, you know, you were already expected to be serving in the militia, and it would be weird, and it would be a problem if you were not serving in some capacity. You know, it wasn't quite like the National Guard or reserves in our modern sense of the organization. It was more loosely organized than that. Like during wartime, or during peacetime, I should say, you know, militia drills were usually held, maybe only 3 times a year, sometimes maybe 6 times a year for a day or two at a time, where they would drill, and also, you know, drinking hard cider and hanging out and camping was also a big part of it. It was, you know, very informal by military standards, especially compared to, say, the British Army at the time, which was, you know, known for very harsh discipline. So it was very much of a citizen soldier organization, even more so than our modern reserves and National Guard. There was not much distinction between civilians and militia, because you were automatically in the militia anyway, essentially. So almost every man was in the militia, at least on paper. They elected their officers, which is also not how it is done in the military today, of course, especially even in the Guard and Reserve. You know, you're appointed by going to particular schools, and, you know, appointed by your superiors and things like that. But back then, men would vote for and elect their officers, and it was very much, you know, your station in society generally reflected your station in the militia or guard. So if you were a prominent man in the community, big landowner, or you know, fairly wealthy, you were expected to also, you know, be a big donator to your church, and probably a deacon in the church, and you were also probably expected to be, you know, an officer, a lieutenant, captain, major in the militia units. As in, you know, if you're in one level of society, you're expected to be that same level in all aspects of society. And, you know, men would, you know, typically vote for, he seems like he's a good guy. He's, you know, you might be his tenant. You might work on his land and own, you know, or might work in his blacksmith shop that he owns. So he's kind of your boss anyway. So I better vote for him to be captain, you know, that type of thing. So that was very common. It wasn't necessarily the most qualified person, you know, militarily to serve as an officer. It was more of what your status in society was from. And really, even in the British Army, the much more professional organized army, it was similar. Officers would purchase commissions generally, as in, you would buy your captaincy when you had the money to afford it. Even in the British Army, men could be promoted. Men could even be promoted from enlisted men to officer ranks, but it wasn't particularly common in the 1700s. So you had to be really competent enlisted man to be promoted to be an officer at that time, particularly in the British Army, or really any European army, really. But they still had a much more organized standard of training and equipment and things like that, which the Americans would be at a disadvantage during the Revolution. Huddy would also serve not only as in the militia, where he would serve as a captain in the Monmouth County Militia. Generally counties would have multiple battalions or sometimes even multiple regiments within a county, depending on the population. And you would serve with your neighbors generally. So your town or village might have its own company, which would be a part of a battalion, which would be part of a regiment. So you were serving in the militia with your neighbors and very often your relatives. And that's just how it was organized, and then continued to be organized that way well into the 19th century. In the Civil War, same thing on a much larger scale. People were serving in state regiments, which were made up of, the companies were made up of usually people from a particular town or county. So you were serving with your uncle and your neighbor and your best friend. And in the 18th century, it was even more so that way with the militia. So in addition to serving as a captain of artillery during the American Revolution with the militia, and artillery was considered somewhat elite at that time. Basically, they were modeled after the British Army. Like everything we had in our society was modeled after the British, basically, because we're British up until that exact moment of declaring independence. And many Americans, especially during the beginning of the Revolution, viewed themselves as Englishmen, and they were fighting for rights that were already owed to them as Englishmen, because England was, we like to think of them as being tyrannical with King George III and all that, but England was far more democratic than really any other country in Europe at the time. So we had inherited a lot of those concept of individual rights from England. And we were the extension of England, living, in even more free, even more English society in the New World. But England was, where a lot of those ideas had come from, because they had killed their own king 100 years earlier with King Charles in the English Civil War. So England had their own revolution 100 years before their, grandsons and great-grandsons had their revolution here in the New World. So Huddy was serving in the artillery, primarily in the Monmouth County Militia as a captain. And the artillery was considered somewhat elite. Generally, you were expected to be able to read and write in the artillery, even for enlisted men, which not so much in the infantry wasn't as important, basically because artillery was considered like a science. It was a little more complicated, actually firing and aiming and moving the cannons, positioning them. So you were expected to be able to read and write orders, that may have been a little more complicated than orders for the infantry, which would be, go over there and do what everyone else is doing, stand there and shoot and reload. Artillery, you had to be a little more knowledgeable, basically. Huddy was already considered a capable leader, and someone that people would naturally follow. Even during the beginning of the Revolution. Let's see here. Just make sure I did this. So also, in addition to serving in the artillery in the militia, he also later on in the Revolution would serve actually as a privateer or a pirate, essentially. Basically, privateers were pirates with a license to operate from the government. In this case, the state of New Jersey issued him a letter of marque, meaning like you were authorized to raid and attack enemy shipping for the duration of the war, and then you, of course, you're only allowed to attack enemy shipping, not just any shipping, as in British or pro-British shipping. And that was important because the Continental Navy was super small, during the Revolution, never more than a handful of ships operating. So there wasn't much of a navy to fight. And of course, the British had by far the largest navy in the world at the time, and also the best navy in addition to being the largest. Many countries, even in Europe, many countries relied on privateers during periods of war because it's very expensive to maintain ships all the time. So why not just hire ships that already had crews and cannons on board to serve temporarily as pirates on your side, essentially. And then basically they would, be allowed to keep a certain percentage of the spoils from whatever enemy ships that they captured. They would, the idea was not to sink a ship, but to capture it, or capture the cargo at least, and then burn the ship if it was, heavily damaged or whatever. And then you would sell that cargo, and then you get to keep a percentage of the cargo. And then generally you would send a percentage to the king or state or whoever issued you your letter of marque. So Huddy was a fairly small scale privateer. He commanded a small privateer vessel known as the Black Snake. More like, this is a little later on, like 1779, 1780. So it was a whaling boat, fairly small boat, but just meant to go around like the Raritan Bay, Sandy Hook Bay, into the New York Harbor at most, type of a thing, like a coastal raider / pirate ship. Was generally crewed by up to 14 men and only had one cannon, a swivel gun, which was a small, not this big cannon that could be, operated by probably two guys pretty easily. Just enough to, stop or harass or potentially take a small unarmed merchant ship. You certainly wouldn't go after a British man of war with that because they would have been, slaughtered. But just enough to harass shipping going into and out of the harbor, because New York was controlled by the British really throughout the entire war. Washington had come out of New England in 1775 and then had basically been chased out of New York and Long Island in 1776 by a British army that had been sent to stop the rebellion. The British idea was to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies because New England was the most clearly Patriot-centered part of the colonies. Like almost everyone really in New England was pretty much a Patriot. So their plan was to isolate New England from the Mid-Atlantic and the southern colonies because those were much more divided than New England was, and try to cut them off from influencing the other colonies and getting supplies to and from New England. Which they were somewhat successful in taking New York and Long Island, and Washington was defeated a couple battles and had to go across New Jersey, and then in 1777, Huddy had also participated in a couple land battles as well. At the Battle of Germantown in Pennsylvania, he was fighting as an artilleryman with the militia, commanding New Jersey troops at that battle, which was somewhat unusual because generally militia were not expected to leave their own state. As in, the New Jersey militia mostly fought in New Jersey. If the British or their allies were in New Jersey, then they would fight them while they were there. But if they were to move to another state, they were not expected to necessarily leave to go continue the battle. But of course, sometimes they did, and Germantown's not that far from New Jersey, in Pennsylvania. But Washington was defeated at Germantown, and the British did eventually take Philadelphia, which was the rebel capital at the time, as well as the largest city in the 13 colonies. So that was a pretty major defeat. But then also then during that time is when Washington's army was suffering in Valley Forge in the winter, but then they would also be trained by von Steuben, who is or Baron von Steuben, who was actually not really a baron. We're pretty certain now. Essentially, he fudged his resume. He was a Prussian officer. He was a real Prussian officer who came to the Americas to serve as an officer in the Continental Army, the American Army. It was one of many European officers, of course, Lafayette being the most famous French officer who came to support the American cause. But von Steuben was probably a captain in the Prussian army, but the Prussian army was, generally considered probably the best army in Europe at the time, or one of the best armies, certainly. So he was considered, an excellent officer, and particularly as a drill master. He drilled a company of 100 men, like, the best men that they handpicked men from the Continental Army, and then those men would then disperse back to their companies to then drill, then serve as a drill instructor. So, once they were trained, now you are the trainer. So they used that winter to, build up their army, build up the army's discipline, which, would also help with morale, which otherwise would have been very low, considering the harsh conditions and the fact that they'd been defeated a couple times the previous season. So after the army reformed itself during that winter, and then in the spring of 1778, the campaign season started again. All armies generally retired for the winter months because it was just mostly so hard to move and fight and coordinate during the winter months. So the British had a relatively easy winter, quartered in Philadelphia. Where there was a decent amount of loyalists in Philadelphia, particularly wealthier merchants whose livelihoods depended on trading, with the old country, with England, selling goods directly back to England. So there was, a fair amount of loyalist sympathies there, even though it was a rebel capital. Also in New Jersey, particularly in Monmouth County, there was also a fair amount of loyalist sympathies. So there was numerous groups of loyalists who served, men from New Jersey who served during that time. One group was known as Skinner's Greens. Their colonel was named Skinner, and many loyalist military groups wore a green jacket. So it wasn't just there was the British Army itself, and then, which was always relatively small. The British never. I think they sent 60,000 men to the North America during the Revolution, which is a lot, but relatively small compared to probably 200,000 Americans served during the American Revolution. But they were all spread out over 13 colonies. So, and generally, most of the American army was militia, and most of the time you didn't leave your home state. So at any given battle, like say the Battle of Monmouth, there was, 13,000 British and 12,000 Americans. So it was fairly common for the Americans to be outnumbered in any given battle because we were so spread out and not coordinated. Whereas the British soldiers, their whole life was the army. You're in the army. You're mostly in the army for long periods of time. It wasn't like you couldn't just leave. You were with your army and you're in a foreign land. So desertion happened, but it wasn't super common. Whereas with the Americans, with the militia, you lived where you were fighting. So it wasn't uncommon for guys just to be like, I'm going to go home, to slip out of the camp and leave. And sometimes there would be severe punishment and sometimes there really wouldn't be. So kind of depended on the situation. So, the Americans after the British were quartered in Philadelphia for the winter, then their plan was to go back to New York because by this point the French had entered the war, and which was a huge deal. France was on par with Britain militarily. France had a superior army and an inferior navy to the British, but they were the other superpower, essentially at the time. So that was a big deal when the French had decided to join after the American victory at Saratoga, upstate New York. Then it was considered a viable option. Okay, the Americans might actually win this thing, so let's go in with them and support them, which they did. So then the British were now afraid of being cut off and trapped in Philadelphia by the French Navy, which could show up at any time and block their escape from the Delaware. So then the plan was to go back to New York, which was much more defensible, and they already had, definite control of the New York area. So they were coming back across New Jersey, and then Washington's plan was to use his newly trained army to try to win a victory against the British, to keep our morale built up and keep this thing going. They weren't expecting to destroy the British army, but if we can win a battle, or at least win a small battle, then we'll that'll be enough for now. So they planned on attacking the British rear guard in Freehold at the Battle of Monmouth. This is June of 1778, and Huddy had also been participating in this battle as well with his militia, and they meant to just attack the rear guard and win a small fight and call it a victory, but then the whole entire British army stopped and turned around, and then it became a much bigger battle than either side had been planning on fighting. The British were just hoping to go back to New York. They were not looking for a fight at that moment. But then it became a full-scale battle, and by some accounts, probably the largest single battle of the Revolution in terms of men actually involved in the fighting at one place. 25,000 men, at least, between the two armies. And also, particularly at Monmouth, it was not just the British Army, but some of the best units of the British Army, like the 42nd Highlanders and the Coldstream Guards, some very famous historic units of the British Army participated, as well as some of the Hessian or German mercenaries who were fighting with the British. The Hessian Jaegers, which were basically riflemen. Most troops carried muskets at the time, which did non-rifled barrels, which are not very accurate. Some American frontiersmen carried the Kentucky long rifle famously, but Europeans also had the rifle too. And they had some, like the Hessian Jaegers, which is German for hunter. They were like skirmishers. They would, not fight in regular line formations. They would, we kind of have this myth that only the Americans had the idea of like running around and hiding behind trees during the Revolution. It's not really true. The British and other European armies did that with skirmishers. So, as in you'd have, a British regiment had 10 companies generally. So you'd have 8 regular companies of guys standing in line, fighting linear usually. And even then, sometimes they would also fight differently. And then you'd have one company of skirmishers who would be on the flanks and moving around the sides, and kind of fighting in what we think of as the Indians, the way they fought, which is how some of the Americans also fought, but not all of them, moving around, maneuvering, which seems like the obvious thing to do, but at the time, even rifles were much more slower to load than a musket, and also compared to today, they still weren't that accurate. So in order to actually defeat the enemy and gain ground, you really had to use those linear tactics, or else you weren't going to accomplish much by just running around and hiding behind trees. You couldn't drive the enemy from the field unless you had the majority of your men, organized. And this is also before radios and things like that. So how could an officer command his men if they're all spread out, all hiding behind trees? You just couldn't do it. And so if you're packed fairly tightly together, you can use your, drums and use your officers to scream out commands, and then you can actually control your army. Whereas if everyone's hiding behind their own tree, you really can't do that. You couldn't get anything done, even if it was safer for the individual. So at Monmouth, which was the first major battle that the Americans fought with this newly trained army, it was their first full-on, like, European-style big linear battle against the British, where they fought in the European style of warfare, toe-to-toe against the British, and in an open field primarily. So that was basically mostly a draw. It was somewhat of an American victory. They didn't stop the British from escaping. The British continued to go on to Sandy Hook, but they inflicted enough casualties on the British where it was, they had more importantly had shown that they could stand up against the British and their Hessian mercenaries in the same manner of fighting, which prior to that, they really had not demonstrated that. So that was definitely a moral victory and probably a slight tactical victory for the Americans at Monmouth, which is, this was a big deal. This is also right after the French had joined, so things were on the upswing for the Americans. So then the British had to go back to New York, and the way they were going to do that was by walking through Sandy Hook, walking through Colts Neck, Middletown, Sandy Hook, and then getting on boats and sailing back to either Manhattan or Staten Island, which were also controlled by the British. So Huddy's men also would, besides the battle itself on June 28th, they would harass them all the way back through Sandy Hook. And then later on, let's see here. We talked about that. Okay. So later on, this is, during not a lull, but the British Army had largely left the area. But there was always still something going on in Monmouth County during the Revolution because there was significant loyalist forces in this area. Farmers who had to sell their goods to someone in order to make money, they still had to sell their goods to merchants, and the merchants were largely in New York selling them, to ships to go to other places, including food that would go to the Caribbean, because many of the islands there were not growing much of their own food, but they're just growing sugarcane, because that was super profitable. So why grow potatoes when you can grow sugarcane and make a lot more money? So farmers here some of that food would go to New York, to people eat it in the city would eat it, or it would even go to the Caribbean. That was not necessarily growing their own food. The Americans, the Continental Army, essentially had to occupy Monmouth County because there was enough loyalist sentiment in the area to be a problem. They wanted to keep the farmers from continuing to trade with the British, who controlled New York. Many of those, many fairly recent British, or I should say English immigrants, in this area remained loyal to England, they had actually been born in England. Depending on which town, so Shrewsbury had a fairly English population, English Episcopalians mostly. They were the most likely to remain loyalists. And then Middletown also had a significant English Episcopal or Anglican population from the Anglican Church, meaning the English Church. Whereas Freehold, for example, had many Scottish, or people descended from earlier Scottish immigrants. Of course, Scotland had no super strong loyalty to England, having fought multiple wars against England, as well as many the original Dutch settlers in Freehold also had no particular loyalty to England because they were not even English. So many of the people in the Freehold area were patriots, Scottish Presbyterians and people descended from earlier Dutch settlers. For example, I have an ancestor, Captain Archibald Gordon, which I think is a cool name. He was, he was a descendant of earlier Scottish immigrants from the Manalapan area, and he had served in the Monmouth County Militia during the Revolution, most likely at the Battle of Monmouth as well. So he was, among that group of people. And his brother was also a major. He was a captain, and his brother was a major in the militia. So, like I was saying before, that's your status in society usually went with your rank in the militia too. So that was but there was still enough of a loyalist population, particularly in the eastern part, Shrewsbury, Middletown, where it was kind of a problem. So the Continentals actually set up, kind of occupied the area. They had defeated, even before the Battle of Monmouth, there had been a much smaller Battle of Monmouth and Freehold, where loyalist forces had been defeated by pro-Patriot militia, and had driven from that area. But then also the Virginian Continentals, as in Americans from Virginia, were used to occupy Shrewsbury, particularly the Allen House in Shrewsbury, which was is a small garrison to basically just keep an eye on the area, because there were a lot of loyalists who were causing trouble and raiding Tinton Falls and raiding other pro-Patriot areas, and burning farms, things like that. Not major battles, but they would harass the American forces in the area. There was another small skirmish at what is now called the Allen House, which you can still see today in Shrewsbury, big red building by the Episcopal Church in Shrewsbury. There was a skirmish there where a couple of Virginian American Continentals were ambushed. That was where they were stationed by local Tories. Tories is the other word for loyalists, which was the political party that primarily stayed loyal to England. It doesn't really add up to our modern sense of political parties, because Tories were the more conservative party at the time, but by today's standards, everyone would have been wildly conservative. So it doesn't really match up to our modern sense of, liberal versus conservative. But generally, loyalists meant Tory, and the Patriots were the pro-American, not loyal to the British side. So there was, a lot of small-scale skirmishing from 1778 after the British left till really the end of the war, 1783. Even after the British had been, had forced to surrender at Yorktown in 1781, there were still loyalists who continued fighting on, partially because they almost had less of a choice. It was almost the British soldier, once the war ended, he was, his unit would be sent home, and he would be sent home, and he would go with them, and that would be it. Whereas the loyalists were from here, so they had to live here. And once the war was over, they were in a worse spot, because they had been, they were going to be ostracized if they weren't already. So they were, fearing that retribution that was going to come once the British Army was forced to leave. So the loyalists continued fighting on even after the British had largely left. And some of those groups, in September of 1780, loyalist forces, including a group called the Black Brigade, which was commanded by a man known as Colonel Titus Tye. He was actually an escaped slave from this area, probably like Tinton Falls area, who had fought for the British cause during the Revolution. Many African Americans or slaves had fought for the British, some for the Patriot side as well, but a greater number for the British side, because particularly in Virginia, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, had issued a proclamation saying, if you fight for my side, the royal government forces in Virginia, then, a slave would then earn their freedom by doing so. He was one of the first governors or leaders to issue that. So Tye had actually escaped and made it all the way to Virginia, during the Revolution, which is a huge feat for an escaped slave to do, at any time, let alone during the war. And he had joined up with what was known as Lord Dunmore's, or the Ethiopian Regiment. they weren't actually Ethiopians. Ethiopian was just a term used to describe Africans at the time in the 1700s. So they were Americans. They were mostly people who were born here, who were literally fighting for their freedom. Whereas the Continentals were also, of course, fighting for their freedom, but these were enslaved people who were directly, in the literal sense of the term, were fighting for their freedom, which was promised to them by the royal governor. So Colonel Tighe was not actually, he didn't hold the colonel's commission in the British Army. It was an honorary title given to him because he was recognized as a leader of men, even though he didn't have a formal commission. But he commanded a group of actually both blacks and whites loyalists, and they had specifically been ordered with capturing Joshua Huddy, who had already been known as a leader in the militia and general troublemaker for the British. So they actually came to his home in Colt's Neck, which was right across the street from the Colt's Neck Tavern, which is still there, and essentially laid siege to his home. This is September of 1780. So Huddy of course fought back, basically he was fighting by himself. He did have the help of one of his servants, a woman named Lucretia Emmons. So she would help him reload his multiple muskets, and he was moving from window to window, shooting to try to appear that he was, had more men fighting with him when he actually did not. And he did actually hold off the Tigh's men for quite some time until they set his house on fire. And then they actually negotiated, during the fight and during the house being on fire, which seems wild, but that's how it was done. They said, all right, I'll surrender. Just you put the fire out and let my servant go. So which Tighe and his men agreed, and they did put the fire out, and they let her go, and they took him prisoner. And the goal was to take him back to Sandy Hook, and then possibly New York, ultimately probably to be executed. So he was taken prisoner, and then while being transported back, actually via boat, across the Shrewsbury River, in what is now Rumson area, they were actually, the local Patriot militia caught up to them. Just, it was, word had spread that his home was attacked. So they caught up to them and fired upon them as they were crossing in canoes, essentially, and killed several of the loyalists. And Huddy was actually wounded in the thigh himself, probably by friendly fire, really. But his canoe capsized, and he was able to swim back to shore into safety. Supposedly, the Americans actually had a cannon in that skirmish as well, that they fired upon the loyalists retreating in the canoes. So Huddy was saved, and then he did recover from his wound. Earlier, at the initial fight at his house, Colonel Tighe had the commander of the loyalists actually had been wounded in the wrist, and he died of his wound. He died of gangrene shortly thereafter. This is, of course, very common. This is long before anything resembling modern medical care. So being wounded was, likely a death sentence. But also, particularly for the Americans, being captured was also likely a death sentence, because the British, did capture many Americans during the war. Sometimes they were exchanged. Americans would be exchanged for British prisoners, which was a common practice in the 18th century. That was done whenever it could be done, arranged basically. But many of those prisoners were kept in. They didn't have prison camps per se, but they kept prison barges, they called them. Particularly in New York Harbor, they had these large ships that were just used as floating prisons, where they would, keep many of the Americans who had been captured during the war. And, of course, there was terrible conditions, living in a prison barge, even if you were a regular sailor in the British Navy, scurvy was a real problem. So if you were an enemy prisoner living in a dilapidated ship, it was rats and disease and everything else. It was getting captured and sent to a prison barge was basically as good as dying, essentially. So that was something you wanted to avoid, of course. So Huddy did escape in 1780, and would live to fight another day, which he did. Let's see here. And so during that kind of middle part of the war, where there was a loyalist activity going on in the militia, and Huddy amongst them were fighting the Tories or loyalists. They had also had several incidents where they hanged individuals who either were or were suspected of spying for the British or aiding the British during that time. So one such incident was Huddy participated in the execution of Stephen Edwards, who was accused of being a spy for the British. He was from Shrewsbury, and his father had been like a local loyalist leader. Let's see, this was in 1777. He was apprehended by Huddy and his men, and not really given a fair trial. Essentially, it was more of like a lynch mob type situation, and he was hanged. And then this would be one of the incidents that would later come back to haunt Huddy. Let's see. We went over that. And then later on, in Ocean County, in Toms River, the Huddy was appointed to serve as a commander of the blockhouse, which was a small fort that was built in Toms River to essentially defend the salt works, which was a very important, part of the infrastructure in the 18th century, as in you needed salt to salt your meat, to give people enough food to survive through the winter. So it'd be like capturing the salt works would be like capturing an oil field today, or something of very vital importance in the area. So they were sent there to defend the salt works. But in 1782, a force of about 80 British soldiers and loyalists would attack. And Huddy had about 25 men with him defending the blockhouse, which they did fight for a period of time, were eventually forced to surrender. And then Huddy, in particular, was taken prisoner. He had already been known as an individual who the British were after in particular. So he was also temporarily held in New York as a prisoner, likely in one of the prison barges I was talking about earlier. But then a group of loyalists, separate than the British government itself, had found out that he was there, and they had basically gotten control of him under the pretense that they were going to do a prisoner exchange, for another, British officer, trading an officer for an officer. So they had, the loyalists had taken him from the actual British custody, but their plan was to actually hang him, which they in fact did. So Huddy was hanged on April 12, 1782, at a place known as Middletown Point, like in the Highland, what is now like Highlands, in the area of Sandy Hook. He was executed there by hanging. And then he was later buried at Old Chenet Church in Manalapan, which is a Presbyterian church in Manalapan, where many patriots from the Revolution are buried there. So he was punished by the Loyalists in particular for his hanging of Stephen Edwards, who was the one man who was accused of spying for the British earlier, as well as his execution of another man a loyalist named Philip White, who had been, a prominent loyalist in the area. And, he was actually supposedly, they put like a sign around his neck, "Up goes Huddy for Philip White." It was the fighting in Monmouth County was very small scale, very much an eye for eye thing. People used the revolution to settle old family disputes, as in this, I feel this guy, kind of stole my land, or even stole, some of my animals 5 years ago. Now he's a loyalist. I'm a patriot. Okay, let's go get some of my friends together and we'll burn his house down. And settle old grudges through the war. It was a lot of tit for tat, back and forth. They would kill someone in your area, and then you would get your friends together and go raid a loyalist area, or vice versa. And that went on for several years. And many of the loyalists after the revolution did in fact leave, because they were on the losing side in the war, and many of them had been and would continue to be likely persecuted, either legally or just ostracized. So many of them fled back to either England if they could afford it, or many of them actually settled in Canada, which had, up until then, there had been very few English-speaking settlers in Canada. Mostly had been French earlier colonists. So the bulk of the original English-speaking Canadian population was actually from descendants of American loyalists who had fled to Canada, or other places in the British Empire, particularly like Nova Scotia, the Eastern Canada. Huddy was executed. He had done a great deal for the American side, which is why the British had targeted him in particular, the loyalists, I should say. Prior to his, or actually, I'm sorry, after his execution, this was toward very near the end of the war. The Treaty of Paris was signed a year later in 1783, but the war had mostly been over on land, at least for almost a year by this point. So, his execution was almost like something after the war. It was like, wait, they're still doing this? It was like the war had mostly ended. So it became a big deal, and the British, the American authorities, including Washington himself, had, got word of this, and he had actually threatened to execute a British officer who is still in custody in retaliation for the execution of Huddy without a real trial. So they had actually they'd gone as far as picking names from a hat or from a lot. And when a British captain who had been in American custody, Charles Assagill, was picked to be executed as retribution. But actually the French government had intervened and convinced Washington not to go ahead with the execution, because there was already peace talks had already started. So this was like, okay, well, we're going to derail the whole peace process by executing this guy who had not done anything to anyone in particular. So Washington was convinced to not go ahead with the execution by a French foreign minister, the Comte of Vigry. Assagill was saved from being executed, then the peace process continued, to go on until it was finally signed in 1783, and the war was officially over, and America was an independent country at that point. Huddy was a major player in the militia, as well as really the war effort in New Jersey in general. Fighting in battles in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and not only participating but being a leader in those battles. So much so that he was, particularly targeted by the British and Loyalist forces. He accomplished a great deal. He's he was a born fighter. He was, probably cantankerous, but he was an obvious leader that people were willing to follow and people were willing to fight with. And he was, he was someone who was elevated by the revolution. If there had been no revolution, we certainly wouldn't remember him in the way that we do. But because there was, he's someone who reached his maximum potential serving on the American side. And, for that reason alone, should be remembered as a patriot, which he was. So that's, pretty much my presentation. But does anyone have any questions or yes?
What was the outcome? The Applegates suing Huddy over the Lincroft Inn.
Oh, yeah, with the Colts Neck Tavern. I don't know of a specific court decision. I think it basically didn't really go anywhere. He was still, to my knowledge, he was still the owner when he died. After he died, I don't really know. I know his wife was still alive, so I imagine she would have been, still the owner.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if they received any compensation or anything like that, unfortunately. It's probably something that could be found, probably like in the Monmouth Historical Association. Probably they have a bunch of records and freehold from that time, but I don't know exactly what the turnout was. Sure. Yes.
Is there anything left of Joshua Huddy's home that was across from the Colts?
Oh, I meant to say that. Yes. The home actually is not there. You can see the foundation though. It's like a square, in the grass. But the home itself is not there right now. But you can see exactly where it was, which is kind of cool.
Is it across Monmouth Road? Or
It's
is it on
across-
the opposite side?
It's that little street, the 537. It's on 537, but then if you turn right at the Colts Neck Inn, then it's just a little bit back, 100 yards or something like that. Yeah. So it's cool. You can't see it, but it's like, oh, that's where it was. The British did not burn it down. They did actually extinguish it, but this is just 240 years later. Anyway, so it's not there.
Is it protected, or it just happens to just be sitting right there?
There's only there's a sign, but it doesn't seem to be it seems like you can just kind of go there. Yeah. I'm not sure its official status because it's not really there anymore, but you can see where it was. Yeah, but it's cool though. And in Tom's River, where the blockhouse was, there's a smaller version of the original fortifications there. It's almost like a.
Oh, so that's not the scale, huh?
I think it's not. I think it's shorter than it would have been, basically. But there's something representing the fort there, but I don't think it's actually the scale.
I always assumed it was the scale. Okay.
I could be wrong. It could be smaller than I imagined it, but I got the impression it was just to represent where it was.
Yeah, and it's not the actual site.
Yeah.
They think the actual site was farther back on, I don't know, there's a firehouse or something
Yeah.
between the Toms River and the street that the courthouse is on.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody, I think the DAR chapter put a sign there in the approximate site of where the blockhouse had been.
Yes.
They do have a lot of monuments and everything in the, they have a whole Huddy Park down there.
Yes. And also in Highlands, there's also another, I think it's just called Joshua Huddy Park as well, which, it's a regular public park you can visit, which is, the approximate presumed site of where he was executed by hanging. So, there's a lot of, there's still some roads and other things. There's the Huddy's Inn restaurant in Colts Neck, which is named after him, which, is, it's not really truly directly associated with them, but he's, as a local famous patriot, he's named after him, among other things. Yes. Any other questions? Or
Yeah, my wife is in the DAR, and we participated in the Roots Across America at
Yes.
Penny Church Cemetery. This is where you have a large monument on, or is it something that would be more difficult?
It's very near. It's pretty near the church, like the actual church building. And this is the Old Tenet Church, Presbyterian Church in Manalapan. You can see it. It has like a a fairly distinct, not big, but you can see the headstone. You can read it. It's
Maybe
like,
December, I'll look for it.
Yeah, yeah. It's probably marked by a flag or some type of symbol.
They do try to, I don't even think they have the records to get everybody, but they try to put a flag.
Yeah, he's one of the
Even if
well-known ones, so I'm
even
sure
if
his
they have
is.
a wreath, they try to put a flag on all the veteran, anywhere, any kind of veterans, grave.
Yes, yes,
There is a little marker on the side of the Shrewsbury River where they're building the new Seabright Rumson Bridge.
yes,
It's supposedly where he swam ashore after the canoe or boat capsized.
yes, yeah. So this, there's a lot. I mean, besides Huddy, there's so much from the Revolution. There's they think there was probably 300 battles or skirmishes in New Jersey alone during the Revolution, most of which were very small. And 100 of those were in Monmouth County, they estimate. So,
There's not.
yes.
Not.
Yes. Mhm. Yes.
And I'm sure you're familiar with Bondy Grave. Bondy Grave right now.
Yeah, that's what I already thought of that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Joshua Huddy's
Right.
picture of the stones on it.
Right now, it's my grandparents.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a very valuable website, Bondy Grave.
Oh, yes, definitely.
I'm sure everybody uses that.
Sure. Yes.
Which side of the family is your ancestor from? Mother's side or father's side?
My father's mother's mothers were Gordons. So I think, that they had been in New Jersey. He'd actually served in the Middlesex County Militia. But he was in what is now Manalapan. It was now Monmouth County, but he was in the Middlesex Militia, which had, there'd been a pretty heavy Scottish population there. So they were Scottish and also Scottish, but had married Dutch women who were already here. So they were Scottish and Dutch from that area.
I understand.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you're saying that Joshua Huddy was born in Salem County and he was a Quaker, his family were Quakers.
Yes.
Do you know where they immigrated from by any chance, the Huddy family?
I know they were English, but I don't know particularly where in England. Yeah. The Quakers were mostly English, and then some.
May have been,
Yeah.
or Presbyterian.
Yes. Most at the time. I mean, now everyone is so mixed. It's hard to tell, but originally, the different denominations went along with national or ethnic groups. England was one of the more divided ones because England actually did have relative religious freedom compared to many other countries at the time. So that's why you had, Quakers and Methodists and Baptists. They weren't all Anglicans, because there was some degree of religious freedom in England. Whereas, say France, it was like the king's Catholic, you're going to be Catholic, and then Spain even more so. So, it was the American Revolution, especially in New Jersey, and especially in Monmouth County, was very much. It was just as much a civil war as anything else. It was different groups all within the same group fighting for different reasons, political, religious, economic reasons. It was. In many ways, it was a civil war, particularly in Monmouth County, where you had enough loyalists and enough patriots living in the same area where they actually would fight each other, and they did. Whereas opposed to New England, where it was pretty solidly patriot, where it wasn't really as much of an infighting thing, but here it really was. So in many ways, it was our first Civil War, and our Civil War was our second Civil War. It was both. It was a civil war, but it was also a revolution. Because it was a big change from the old order. Rejecting the aristocracy and rejecting the tyrannical government. So it was definitely a revolution, but it was also a civil war at the same time between Americans, who had also all been English subjects. And in varying degrees, many of them thought of themselves as Englishmen fighting for their rights that were already owed to them as Englishmen, not so much as we're going to start a new country. they were rebelling against specific things that the Parliament had started taxing them for, and then it kind of grew into a national, we're going to separate from England movement, but it hadn't really been hadn't been the goal in the very beginning. But it evolved into that. Yes. And also in large part thanks to the French, which I think, is one thing that we very often forget about during the Revolution. They were our first ally. They were our oldest ally. And we very likely would not have become independent had it not been for French intervention.
I heard that the expenditure that the French did contributed to the French Revolution.
Oh, it definitely did. Yeah, I mean, war was expensive and is expensive. So the war that and also it wasn't like the French were just fighting. It wasn't like they just sent ships to North America. They were fighting all over the world. They were fighting in the Caribbean, as well as naval battles all over the planet against the British. So it became a much bigger war than just the. I think even in India, I think there was some fighting between the British and French during the Revolution. So it became a world war, really. But we think of it as just on the east coast of America, but it became a worldwide war. And also the Spanish and the Dutch were also involved, but France was the big one in terms of our allies, of actually supplying rifles and cannons and equipment. Many of the Americans, the militia, you pretty much brought your own gun from home. But once we formed the Continental Army, they started issuing standard issue things. So they had captured British Brown Bess muskets, as well as Charlesville muskets, which were the French muskets that they had sent to us, by the thousands, which was, a big deal. Guns were expensive, and there weren't many. There was 0 factories here. Blacksmiths could make 1 or 2 at a time, but we definitely needed their help, basically, and we did receive it.
On behalf of the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey here in Seagirt, I would like to thank Mr. Bill Gardell for the fabulous background on the American Revolution, as well as its patriot, Joshua Huddy. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Well, thank you.